I was in the Marine Corps, and I went in 1943.
43. And where did you get stationed?
Well, I went from here to San Diego and went through Marine Corps boot camp out at the Marine Corps base in San Diego, and from there I was sent overseas to I can't remember the first. Oh, we stopped in Oahu, and I was in a little transit center there where I did a little guard duty for a few weeks or months, and that was kind of a stop to get to the where the real war was going on,
Right.
and just was placed in the Second Marine Division, and then we just continued on and went across the Central Pacific, island hopping.
Island hopping. What battles were you involved in?
Well, I was in Saipan, Tinian, Okinawa, and another little island which was pretty insignificant called Ieshima, Iheya. There were two that was in the Okinawa group. Ernie Pyle was killed on another Ieshima, but the way they spelled the island he was on was Ieshima, and this was Iheya, Shima.
Right.
Well, I know we stormed ashore like gangbusters and got ashore there, and in fact we had one or two guys killed by our own fire on the landing, and come to find out the Japanese had already evacuated. I think we found one Japanese pilot on the island, so no resistance, but we were prepared for it had it occurred. But fortunately, it did not occur.
What was your toughest recollection?
Oh, golly, the day I was wounded, of course, on Okinawa on June 18th,
What year?
1945.
45.
And I have been told earlier the morning that all that happened, we had a visit from the commanding general of the 10th Army Corps, who was the overall and had overall command of the operation. There were Marine Corps divisions and Army divisions, and Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner was the commanding general. And he came up to visit us the morning of the 18th, and he was in our battalion, CP, which was behind us quite a little bit, but we could see the activity back there. We knew they were there, and we knew who was there. Our battalion commander and regimental commander was there back there with General Buckner. And during the course of while he was there, of course, he has a three-star general always had a little entourage.
Right.
He had people, aides and all that kind of stuff, advisors, and they attracted a little attention. And the Japanese opened fire, and with mortars and some small artillery. And in the course of that little barrage, he was killed.
The general?
The general was killed right there. There's a marker there on that spot right now with his name on it. And I was told later on, I don't know how true this is. I would not challenge it, but I'm kind of doubting some of it, the veracity of it, that he was the only three-star general killed in World War II. I don't know how much truth there is to that or anything, but that's what has been told to me by others, and I don't know how.
We could probably verify that.
Well, I'm sure there's. Yeah, I'm sure that you could verify it. If it was, it's really not important to me, but it may be to y'all.
Yeah. Well, please continue.
Well, that pretty well ended my experience in the Pacific.
But you haven't recounted how you were wounded. You told about the general.
Well, I got hit by a rifle fire, a single rifle bullet penetrated my right shoulder and into my chest and came out and just missed my spine about that far. And when it exited my body, and which have thank God many times that I was lucky enough to have that to happen. And then we were having, it was a pretty I don't know how the word to use. It was they were really concentrating on us that day, and we ran into just like they were like a hive of bees. They were swarming everywhere. Japanese were, we were kind of halfway pinned down, so to speak, and could not do a whole lot of advancing or retreating or anything else. Not that we were going to retreat, but one little interesting sidebar to that was I had a little group that had gone up ahead of out in front of the lines to try to find a machine gun that was creating a lot of problems for us, and we got up there. It was 4 of us or 5 of us, I think, and I was speaking to B.A. Allman, a Browning automatic rifleman, who was right next to me, about probably 10 feet or something like that. And I called his name, and he didn't respond to it. And I crawled over there, and he had taken a round right through the top of his head, and of course killed instantly.
Right.
And he was a young lad from someplace in Louisiana. I cannot remember. I remember his name real well, his last name real well, and I have always regretted that I did not go and find his parents after the war was over and explain to them what happened to him. That would have been so meaningful to them.
Sure.
But I failed to be aware of it at that time, and became aware of it later on, which was too late. They would have been dead, and I did not really have the information to know precisely what little area he was from in Louisiana, anyway. And we finally got out of there. They carried me. One particular guy who was a 3-stripe sergeant who was our platoon guide, kind of hauled and dragged me back to safety, so-called safety, and was putting me down, and he had carried me a lot of the way slung over his shoulder. And as he was putting me down in a little depression there, which had about that much water in it, I think, I got hit 3 more times by a machine gun fire. And how in the world they missed him in all that encounter, I shall never know to this day. And but anyway, they finally got me kind of halfway patched up where I was losing a lot of blood, and they had given me 3 units of plasma, and I'm not sure all of this fits in with what we're doing.
Absolutely, it does. Well, this is all tied to the greatest generation.
Okay, okay. And anyway, to make a long story short, they were making an effort and did get me safely out of danger, and carried me. They carried me a little ways. They would carry me on their hands and knees and on a stretcher, and of course with a lot of small arms fire going awful all around us during that point in time, and they carried me a ways. They put me on a half track and carried me a ways, and the final transportation that I used was a little. They called it a grasshopper. It was a Piper Cub that it had room for the pilot and one stretcher in it, and they put me in that little thing and flew me back out of any danger and fire into it, and placed me in I guess it was an Army field hospital. I'm not really sure, but I think it was Army, and I recall they had cut all my clothes off of me. I was lying up there in an operating tent, just in my birthday suit, and I asked those girls, the Army nurses there, I says, "Don't y'all have a bit of modesty around here?" And they laughed at me. One of them brought about a 6x6 towel over there, tossed it to me. She says, "Does that help?" Of course, at that point in time, I couldn't see the humor in it, but now I can. And that was oh golly, the next day, I think or 2 days later, they evacuated me from the island of Okinawa and put me aboard a C-54, which is a 4-engine Army aircraft, and flew me to a naval hospital on the island of Guam. And they put me in there, and I stayed there for about 2 weeks. And then they put me aboard the hospital ship, the USS Solus, which is still in operation.
Really?
It is. I happened to see it and hear about it on one of those things on TV one time, not so terribly long ago. And anyway, we headed back to the States. And the skipper of the Solus had family on Oahu, in the Hawaiian Islands. And they stopped the ship. Of course, he was the skipper. And I'm sure he had okay from higher ups. But anyway, we stopped there for a couple of days so he could visit with his family a little bit. And then we got underway and came to San Francisco, and landed in San Francisco on my 20th birthday. And then they put me in a receiving hospital. It had 2 long rows of beds in there. They probably, maybe as many as, I would guess, as many as 150 in that bed. In that receiving hospital ward, it was one ward, wasn't the entire hospital. But during the course of the next few hours, the next day, I think maybe, I heard a guy down the row of beds from me, and he was giving the RNs uncharted hell about something, and I said, "Golly, that voice sounds so familiar." And I finally got up nerve enough I yelled out down there, and I thought it was Elmer Smith Jr., who was from Batesville.
Right.
You know, Gaines' older brother.
Right.
And that's who it was, and it was Elmer Jr. He had taken a piece of shrapnel in his groin, and it didn't do any major damage, but it was enough to hospitalize him. And he had been wounded previously on Guadalcanal earlier. And I called out his name. I says, "Elmer, is that you?" And it got his attention, and he said, "Who said that?" And I said, I hollered out, it was me and who I was. And that was so funny. Elmer Jr. did not fuss a bit more after he found out he had somebody from Batesville that had listening to him. He was quite a character. Elmer Jr. was quite a character.
Did y'all come back home together?
No. In fact, I didn't even see him anymore after we left. They tried to. They said they would. They wanted everybody to tell them the nearest naval hospital to our hometowns, and of course I immediately told them Millington up here, and even though it was a small one, but they put us aboard trains, and we went across country. I went to Chicago, and then from Chicago down, we'd stop and maybe spend the night somewhere. They'd sidetrack the rail cars that would carry the patients. And I finally found out where I was going, and it was a Charleston naval yard in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's where we went, and which was fine. That was the closest they could get me to. They couldn't get me in Millington; it was already full, and which was okay. It just didn't really make a whole lot of difference.
I tell you what, Mr. Seale, that hearing that story, I now understand precisely why Mr. Dunlap said that called you the toughest son of a bitch he knows about. And
Oh my God, David, Bob has a penchant for exaggeration now.
Danny and I just folded out there on the field. We never made it back. We got shot like that.
No, that's not true. That's not true.
Do you have any other experiences prior to that in combat?
Well, sure, but some of them. Listen, this has been 70 odd years ago, and my memory has turned to mush.
I don't believe it.
My health is reasonably well for a 90-year-old man, but my brain power is escaped me. It's gone.
Do you remember, because this ought to be seared in your memory for sure, do you remember the first time you were in combat, the first time you took fire and had to send fire?
Yes.
Can you tell us about it?
Well, it was pretty uneventful, really. We were just moving across the island, and I recall that they, being I was a replacement in the 2nd Division, and they had given me, of course, I had all my gear to carry and everything, and they gave me one of these 5-gallon expeditionary cans full of water. And I had to carry that thing, and we were dealing with those Japanese out in front of us, and it was uncomfortable to have to pay attention to that water can when I needed to be paying attention to the enemy. So that was kind of funny, but it wasn't funny to me at the time. I was mad enough to. Eat a live mule, and but that didn't get me out of carrying that can, 5-gallon can of water. But I didn't have to carry it the next day, so somebody else got it the next day. That's always a few little instances like that are funny. I can remember one time we were. I think this was on Tinian. The Japanese counterattacked one night, did pull one of their famous banzai attacks, come charging at you like a bunch of wild Indians screaming and carrying on. And there was a 37 millimeter. We had moved up into position kind of late in the day. It was almost dark. And by the time we got up there and it was on a little ledge or mountainside, hillside, and it was mostly coral, and it had been shattered quite a bit by all the artillery fire and stuff like that. But this 37 millimeter, and we couldn't, normally you dig your foxhole to get in to spend the night. But we couldn't, it was nowhere to dig. So we just had to pile some of that stuff up in front of us a little bit to kind of protect ourselves. But this 37 millimeter, whom I found out many years later was, I had developed a friendship with him at a later time, and in the course of events we were talking about it one time, and he was explaining to me what they were doing. They were that 37 millimeter was a single shot, a 37 millimeter gun. It was really primarily an anti-tank gun, but they would use it. They would shoot what they called. Oh my gosh, I can't think of the name of it now. Anyway, it's something about like buckshot. It would shoot buckshot for personnel, and that they were firing that gun that night. I think there was 6 or 7 guys, crew on that gun. They were firing that gun. You would have thought it was an automatic. It was so fast and unbelievable. And they mowed them down the next day when it got to be daylight. We realized what damage that they had done. But every individual on that single gun was wounded. Not severely, just pretty insignificant wounds that they were, but all 7 of the crew was wounded. And stayed with it. Oh yeah, like I say, they were not severe. Some of them were just didn't hardly amount to anything, but it was enough to be declared a wound. And so that was an interesting little episode. And I learned all of this from the guy. He was from a little town called Mableville, Arkansas, and he stayed in the Marine Corps. He was got to be a sergeant major, and he was telling me all that stuff about what we were kind of just exchanging stories to each other, and because you never know, what somebody 20 yards away from you was doing. It just didn't happen. You just didn't know it. And he was telling me about that, I was telling him about that gun. And he said, were you close to that gun? I said, I could have thrown a rock over there and hit him. And he said, he was telling me about he was on that gun. And that they had every one of them had received a wound. Although a lot of them, most of them were just minor. Right. But I said, my gosh, that's pretty well a record as far as I was concerned, that all 7 of them would be recipients of a wound.
So what year did you make it back to Batesville?
Oh, I came back home in 45. I stayed over there in that hospital altogether, and I was hospitalized probably about maybe close to 7 months.
And you and Georgia got married?
Quite. I couldn't make Georgia a living, and I wanted to get married, but I couldn't. I couldn't make her a living. And I went to school a little bit and got enough to get married because I was scared she was going to get away from me, and but thankfully I managed to hold on. Oh gosh, yeah. Well, things happen. I remember, my gosh, 20 years after World War II, after we were through with it all and everything, I got this call from a guy up in Ohio, and he asked me, you know, if I was. Of course, my first name is James, and you know, in the military or anywhere else, you had to put first name, middle initial, and last name. So he was uncertain about it because it was listed as James Seale. And he says, I was unsure about this. And I said, well, and I explained it to him why it was that way, and he understood completely. And he was a guy that had hauled me to safety, really,
Really?
on the 18th of June, yeah. And can't remember his name now. He just died here a couple of years back. He lived up in Willoughby, Ohio, which is it's not little, it was about 100,000 people, a suburb of Cleveland. And he was telling me about, you know.
How did you cross paths with him 20 years later?
He called me on the telephone.
Oh.
He had read it in a directory of the 2nd Marine Division Association thing that we belonged to. And he had read it, and he says, we all thought you were dead. They had the word was out that you had been jerked into a cave and were killed. Of course, I didn't know anything about that. So, and I said, no, Larry, that's a mistake. That didn't happen. And but to make a long story short, they awarded him. He already had 1 Silver Star, but they awarded him, in effect. I like to say that they awarded him another Silver Star for saving my rear end. And but he says, well, not really, because he said they did award me another Silver Star, but they said for the events of the day. And I said, well, that included you dragging me to safety. And he kind of laughed about it. He said, but I don't think that's what the Silver Star was for. I said, oh, I'm disappointed. So, but anyway, he was, Larry died a couple of years back. He had pretty severe physical problems. And he died, and his family had him buried in Arlington.
Right.
So, which is where he should have been.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because he was a recipient of 2 Silver Stars, and everybody don't get those. Of course, I know a lot of people that should have had Medal of Honor didn't get anything. You know how that goes. But I was no hero. I got everything I deserved.